You have done something wrong at some point in your life. Not seriously wrong. Probably nothing that would define you to the people who know you, but wrong. Now imagine that the people around you got to decide what happened next. Not a judge, not a written law, not an appointed official with a defined procedure. The actual human beings who share your fire, your food, your shelter. 20, 30 people. The ones your life depends on and who depend on yours. They sit together. You are discussed. A conclusion is reached. And what comes next is proportionate, not to what you did, but to what it cost the group. That is how justice worked for most of human history. And the things they decided make every prison system ever designed look like a courtesy. We talk about prehistoric humans as if law was something they hadn't gotten around to yet, as if punishment only became available once someone invented a courthouse. That is wrong. Groups surviving together under permanent threat do not tolerate disruption. The margins are too thin. Theft during a famine is not a moral offense. It is a survival threat to every person in the group. Cowardice during a hunt does not mean shame. It means someone's child eats less this winter. Betrayal of any kind in a group of 30 people, where 30 people is the entire world you have access to, is not a crime. It is an act of war against the only thing keeping you alive. The responses were designed for those stakes, not for the law school, for the cave. These are 10 prehistoric punishments so brutal that history could not write about them because writing had not been invented. It preserved them instead, in bone, in peat, in skulls, opened in ways that took decades for anyone to acknowledge, and in a pattern so consistent across continents and millennia that it is impossible to call it anything other than a system. Number 1. Bog death. In 1950, 2 brothers cutting peat in the Jutland Peninsula of Denmark found a face. Not a skull. A face. Preserved so completely by the cold acid chemistry of the bog that one of the brothers immediately cycled to the nearest town and reported a recent murder to the police. He was not entirely wrong. The man in the peat was real. The killing was real. It had simply happened 2,000 years earlier. Tolland Man died sometime between 400 and 200 BCE. He was found with a braided leather rope still fastened around his neck, knotted behind the left ear in a way that suggested careful construction rather than improvisation. His expression was calm. His eyes were closed. Scientists from the Copenhagen National Museum analyzed the contents of his digestive system and found his last meal, a porridge. Barley, flaxseed, pale persicaria, and at least a dozen species of wild plants, carefully made, consumed several hours before his death. He was not killed in panic or in anger. He was fed carefully, and then he was hanged with deliberate, methodical attention. Archaeologist P.V. Glob spent decades studying bog body finds across northern Europe. His documentation of the pattern was comprehensive. These were not impulsive killings. Lindoman, found in a Cheshire bog in England in 1984, had been struck on the skull 3 times with enough force to fracture it. His throat had then been cut. He had then been pushed face down into the water. Any single one of those acts would have killed him. All 3 were carried out anyway. The redundancy is the message. Each act was a layer. Each layer was intentional. The body was placed at the margin of the bog, which in northern European prehistoric cosmology represented the threshold between the world of the living and whatever came next. What these individuals had done to earn this death cannot now be reconstructed. The bogs preserved their flesh and not their crimes. But the consistency of the pattern across hundreds of years and thousands of square kilometers tells us something. This was not improvised. It had been done before and would be done again. Whatever these people had cost their groups, the group knew exactly what the response was. Number 2, abandonment. This one has no dramatic find attached to it, no preserved face, no famous site. That is precisely the point. Abandonment leaves no archaeological signature at all. You walked into the cold, and you did not come back, and the record of your death exists nowhere, because you died somewhere alone, and your bones were scattered, and that was the intention. Archaeologist Brian Hayden from Simon Fraser University, in his extensive research on prehistoric social control mechanisms, identified abandonment as one of the oldest and most consistently documented forms of group punishment across cultures. You were not killed. You were removed. And in a world where a single human being alone in the open at minus 20 degrees Celsius had a survival window measured in hours, removal from the group was not a lesser sentence than death. It was slower. It was lonelier. And it required the group to do nothing they would have to justify to themselves afterward. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm, in his book Hierarchy in the Forest, documented the process across dozens of separate hunter-gatherer groups on multiple continents. The sequence was consistent every time. First, gossip. The group began discussing the transgressor's behavior in every conversation they were not part of. Then, reduced sharing. Food access diminished. Inclusion in activities diminished. The social warmth that made group life survivable was withdrawn incrementally. Then, if the behavior continued, physical removal, directed specifically at the season when outside the group meant death the fastest. Not a dramatic expulsion, a quiet one. You are no longer here, and everyone else remains, having watched and understood what the watching meant. Number 3, trepanation without consent. Most people who learn about prehistoric trepanation understand it as medicine, and in many documented cases, they are correct. Archaeologist John Verano from Tulane University has studied trepan skulls across South America, Europe, and Central Asia across decades of fieldwork. The majority show healed bone around the opening. The patient survived months or years after the procedure. Medical trepanation, practiced across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, was likely used for head trauma, dangerous intracranial pressure, and conditions we might today approach with similar surgical tools. But there is another category. Skulls where the opening shows no regrowth, where the cuts are hurried rather than careful, irregular rather than measured. Skulls that also carry other injuries at other locations, suggesting the procedure did not occur in any context of medical care. In at least some of these cases, the evidence supports a different interpretation. The skull was opened not to heal the person, but because of something the group had decided about what was inside them. In multiple documented prehistoric frameworks across different geographic regions, behavior that severely threatened the group was not always understood purely as a personal failing. It was attributed to something operating through the individual, something that could in principle be accessed and dealt with directly. Whether this was believed literally or served as ritual framing for a decision already made, the functional outcome was identical. The person was held down. The skull was opened. Everyone present witnessed both the act and its stated justification. The memory of it functioned as its own deterrent long after the person it was performed on was gone. Number 4. Binding and exposure. In 2016, archaeologists from Cambridge University completed excavation of a site on the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya. 27 skeletons, dating to approximately 10,000 years ago. Men, women, children. Most showed evidence of violent death. Crushed skulls, shattered knee joints, and in several individuals, something that stopped the researchers. Wrist positioning consistent with binding at the moment of death, not the arrangement of burial. The position of restraint. One woman among the dead was pregnant. Publishing in Nature, the Cambridge team described the site as evidence of organized, deliberate intergroup violence. But within that category, a distinct subset of individuals showed injuries inconsistent with combat. Controlled, targeted, inflicted on someone who was restrained and could not respond. Bound, positioned, and left. Whether left alive to die from exposure or killed in that position is not always determinable from bone alone. The binding itself carried the message. Anthropologist Stephen LeBlanc from Harvard's Peabody Museum documented this pattern across multiple prehistoric sites in Europe and the Americas. A bound body at a water source, at a territorial boundary, at a visible elevated position was a statement in a medium that required no language to decode. This person was judged. Collectively. The binding was the signature of the verdict, visible to anyone who came after, for as long as the body remained. We did this, together, because it was warranted. Number 5. Skull processing. In 2011, researchers at the Natural History Museum in London published findings from Gough's cave in Somerset, England. Skull fragments dated to approximately 15,000 years ago. The skulls had been processed after death. Muscle and soft tissue removed with stone tools. Brain extracted through an opening made at the base of the skull. The inner surfaces of the skull cap had been carefully smoothed, shaped, and in at least 3 cases worked into forms consistent with drinking vessels. Paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer, who led the analysis, was measured in his language. The evidence was consistent with ritual cannibalism, ceremonial use of the dead, or both simultaneously. What the analysis could not establish was whether the individuals whose skulls were processed had died of other causes beforehand, or whether the processing was itself the context of death. What it could establish was that a subset of the skulls carried trauma marks at other locations that predated the processing. Impact wounds, penetrating injuries, evidence that these individuals had been killed before the processing began. Anthropologist Tim White, studying analogous sites across Europe, documented the distinction. The transformation of a person's skull into a functional object was the most complete form of erasure available to a group without written language. You were not mourned. You were not buried. You were repurposed. Used until you were no longer useful, then discarded with the refuse. What you did stayed with no one. What was done to you demonstrated everything that needed demonstrating. Number 6. Controlled starvation. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes from the University of Utah, in research spanning multiple hunter-gatherer societies, documented that food distribution within prehistoric groups was hierarchical, calculated, and in documented cases used as a direct mechanism of social enforcement. the best cuts to the hunters first, because their performance was the group's food supply. Children and the elderly at the end, calibrated to contribution. And below that, individuals the group had decided had broken something significant. They received last access and minimum portions. In a world where 3 days of inadequate caloric intake began to impair physical performance, and 2 weeks of deficit produced measurable cognitive collapse, this was not a soft punishment. Physiologist Ansel Keys documented in the 1944 Minnesota starvation experiment what deliberate caloric restriction did to healthy young men over months of controlled conditions. Within weeks, aggression without cause, nightmares about food, loss of concentration. Some participants began consuming inedible materials. One cut off his own fingers. That was a controlled 20th century study, with doctors observing and an exit available at any time. Ancient humans went through similar processes every winter, without control, without exit, as simple reality. They did not need the study. They had watched starvation work many times. They understood exactly what withdrawing someone from adequate food distribution meant, how quickly it worked, and how completely it incapacitated the person's ability to resist or argue. The punishment contained its own resolution. Number 7. Burning. Archaeologists have found evidence of controlled fire, use almost 1,000,000 years old, in the South African cave of Wonderwork. Anthropologist Francesco Berna and his team documented burned bones and plant material at depths impossible to reach by natural fire. Someone carried that fire into the cave intentionally, almost 1,000,000 years ago. Fire was not an accidental discovery. It was a technology, the most important technology any group possessed, and it was used on people. The direct archaeological evidence is scattered and difficult to confirm unambiguously. But researcher James Cole from the University of Brighton, in his 2017 analysis of prehistoric human remains across multiple sites, identified a subset of burned human bone showing patterns distinguishable from intentional cremation burial. The temperature differentials, the distribution across the body, the partial and targeted nature of the burning, as opposed to the complete and arranged burning of ceremonial cremation. Evidence suggesting fire had been applied deliberately to a living person, or one very recently dead, rather than arranged for post-mortem ritual disposal. In ethnographic records of multiple societies, burning as punishment for the most severe category of transgression served a specific communicative function. Fire was visible at distance. Fire was audible at distance. Fire was comprehensible to every person in range without explanation. Using it on a person transformed the most essential and universally understood technology in the prehistoric world into a declaration. This is what happens at this level of cost. The demonstration was the point, not the punishment. Number 8. Exclusion from burial. Burial was not simply disposal. In the prehistoric world, it was a claim. You belonged here. You mattered to this group. Your death is being recognized. Your body is being returned to the earth with intention, with care, with objects that cost us something to place here, with arrangement that took time and thought. Archaeologists across Europe and the Middle East have documented elaborate prehistoric burials. Bodies positioned carefully, ochre, pigment, grave goods, evidence in some cases of flowers placed on or near the body, objects sourced from hundreds of kilometers distant. These burials are declarations. This person was ours, and then there are the others. Bodies found in positions suggesting rapid, careless disposal, dumped rather than placed. No goods, no arrangement. Sometimes deposited in middens, in refuse areas, in the same locations used for discarding animal bones and other waste. The contrast within identical time periods and regions is not accidental. Paleoanthropologist Christopher Stringer and colleagues documented this pattern across both Neanderthal period sites and anatomically modern human sites. Some individuals received ceremony, others received disposal. The decision was not anatomical. It was social, made by the living about what this specific dead person had been and what they deserved. Exclusion from burial was a punishment the person could not feel, but it was a punishment everyone who had known them could read for as long as the evidence lasted. Your name went nowhere. Your story ended with you. Number 9. Deliberate maiming. Paleopathologist Eric Trinkhaus from Washington University in St. Louis has spent decades analyzing injuries in ancient skeletal populations. Among his most significant findings are healed injuries. Healed, meaning the person survived long enough for the bone to begin reconstruction, meaning they remained in the group long enough to be fed and protected through weeks or months of physical incapacitation. Some of these healed injuries are combat injuries, accidents, the expected damage of a physically demanding life. Others are not. Specific fingers removed cleanly at a joint, evidence of precise cutting through anatomical structures in ways that required knowledge of the anatomy and intent about the outcome, not the damage of violence, the damage of a deliberate procedure performed by someone who understood exactly what they were removing and what the person would permanently lack afterward. Healed, meaning the person kept living, meaning the group kept them alive, carrying the evidence into every day, every interaction, every task that now required what was no longer there. In multiple ethnographically documented societies, specific forms of deliberate, permanent physical marking served as public records of transgression, permanent enough that it could not be hidden, specific enough that people who encountered it understood what category of behavior it represented. You remained in the group and continued to contribute, but every day was also a confession. Anthropologist Paul Tacon from Griffith University, studying ancient body modification evidence, documented patterns consistent enough across separated cultures to suggest codified meaning. This was not decoration. It was vocabulary, written in the bodies of the people who had broken the rules that kept everyone else alive. Number 10. The final category. Archaeologist Stephen Mithen, in The Prehistory of the Mind, argued that ancient humans were cognitively identical to us. Same emotional architecture, same need for consistency, for consequence, for the knowledge that the group enforces the rules that keep it functioning. What differed was not the impulse. What differed was scale. 20 people can manage justice through direct collective action. 2 million cannot. We built courts and codes and prisons and documented procedure because the groups got too large for personal justice. Before that point, justice was immediate, visible, and performed in front of everyone who mattered. Anthropologist Lawrence Keeley, from the University of Illinois at Chicago, compiled data from hundreds of prehistoric burial sites across multiple continents. His conclusion was direct. The percentage of the prehistoric population dying from violence was significantly higher than in any period of recorded history, including the 20th century, with all its wars. But within that category of violent death, a specific subset was distinct from warfare. The injuries were consistent. Blow to the posterior of the skull, multiple strikes from the same instrument at the same angle, the signature of execution rather than combat. Execution means a decision made before the act, not passion, not accident, policy. Someone in a group of 20 or 30 people had been discussed, weighed, judged, and sentenced before the sun came up. And when the sun came up, the sentence was carried out, and everyone present witnessed it and understood what it meant for them if they made the same decision. We have added a great deal of infrastructure to that process since then. The process itself has not changed.